Hello, class, and welcome to my review for discussion board posts for Module 2. I will be doing mine on Chapter 5 from Sacred Scripture, Sacred War, the Bible, and American Revolution. The chapter is entitled The Liberty Wherewith Christ Has Made Us Free. The author covers some broad picture points while focusing in on some specific examples. He begins by talking about the popularity of the apostles Peter and Paul in colonial America and how they were popular for loyalists who cited their verses on civil obedience, civil government, and popular for patriots who often would quote Paul's reference to liberty in the book of Galatians. The controversy centered kind of on two main texts. There's, of course, appeal to a lot of different texts in Scripture, but two primary texts were the teachings in 1 Peter 2 and also Romans 13. Both seemed to convey obedience to civil government, but they were both used for rhetorical polemics on all sides of the argument. Second, the quote, the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free from Galatians 5:1 was seen as a rallying cry for patriots and used as motivation to, in the words of Paul, stand fast for freedom. Again, the two texts, and the author goes over these two texts quite a bit in their historical context of the Revolutionary period. Romans chapter 13, the first 7 verses specifically, and 1 Peter 2:13 through 17, both very, very important. And so when we look at speakers like John Wesley, who is a big name in the Methodist movement, of course, created Methodism, and he wrote a calm address to our American colonies in which he, quote, counseled tranquil deliberations instead of frenzied patriotism. He suggested that patriots were being misled and that to fear God was also to honor the king. This, of course, earned huge support from the British for Wesley and his writings and his theology. The author goes on to discuss John Fletcher and his work entitled The Bible and the Sword, basically a defense of the king to wield the sword against the colonists, but it should be done with tenderness. I'm not sure what that means, and I don't know that they were either, but that plays into an interesting point that he brought up, which was that he admonished the British for their own sins and said that these rebellions were the fault of the crown, namely due to its taking part in the act of slavery, the enslavement of African peoples. And this brought, of course, a whole host of issues that wouldn't be solved for many, many years, but he argued that this was possibly the cause of some of the rebellion. Then we have Charles Inglis, The Duty of Honoring the King sermon. He felt that being pro-monarchy was the same as being Christian and vice versa. Being Christian meant being in favor of supporting the monarchy. These went hand in hand, and that Peter, when he wrote his text, meant obedience to all rulers, not just the just ones. The author then moves to Jonathan Mayhew's Discourse Concerning Unlimited Submission and Non-Resistance to the Higher Powers. This was 25 years before the Revolution, but had a huge impact on people like John Adams, which conveyed the exact opposite idea, which was that the only obedience one is owed is to the ruler who was just and working within a Christian model of justification. This, of course, kind of goes along with what many of John Calvin's followers did following the Reformation. John Calvin was very careful not to be pro-revolution, but his followers went a little bit further and said that you could as long as it was against an unjust ruler. I'll bring up a couple points of this at the end. This was the overarching argument, according to the author, of the patriots during that time, was obedience was only due to a ruler who was just, and again, operating in a Christian manner. Of course, this leaves a lot up to interpretation of what exactly that meant. The author then draws some corollaries to the French Revolution, which followed the American Revolution, and how many Americans were for it until they saw what the revolution could become and how basically unholy it became in its actions. The article concludes with how instrument Peter and Paul's writings were and how all sides used them to compel others, which is a fascinating area of inquiry, and it's actually what I will be doing my final research paper on. So I have a lot of sources already compiled for this very topic, and I will list them in the post just so that you guys have some reference of how you can tackle this question. But there's a couple points I wanted to make. Like I said earlier, I had written my thesis paper in my class on the Reformation on John Calvin's political theory. And this is an interesting area that kind of went a lot of different directions immediately following Calvin and had its impact on America, as we can see with this very topic. Calvin himself never specifically said he was in favor of revolution, armed resistance, but he was also very careful, and he didn't really exclude it as a possibility. His followers just kind of went one step further. On this topic, if you have any interest in pursuing it, a couple of really, really interesting books cover multiple sides of this topic. I have listed below Brad Gregory's The Unintended Reformation. Brad Gregory's a Roman Catholic, and so he talks a little bit more about some of the negative aspects of the Reformation, but it's very much well worth reading. Ralph C. Hancock, Calvin and the Foundations of Modern Politics. Great look at what Calvin thought about politics. Luther and Calvin on Secular Authority is just a collection of their writings kind of put together in a small book that specifically focus in on this topic. And then Calvin's Political Theology and Public Engagement of the Church, Christ's Two Kingdoms, very much well worth reading and diving into. And then a couple of other more philosophical looks at Christianity in relation to war in general. Daryl Charles and Timothy Demme, War, Peace, and Christianity. And then Alexander Webster and Daryl Cole have a fascinating book called The Virtue of War, Reclaiming the Classic Christian Traditions, East and West, which is an absolutely fascinating inquiry into the concept of war and how that would be justified or unjustified in a Christian context. And I'll also have a couple of references for this specific period, the American Revolutionary period, that I've come across in my research for my upcoming thesis paper. So thanks, and hope you enjoyed the review.